Hello, all you international business scholars, you IB scholars out there. This is Dr. T with our very first chapter spotlight video. Today we're going to cover chapter 1. If you recall, these chapter spotlight videos, because this is an online course, it's not intended to be a full-blown lecture as it would be in a face-to-face course. Rather, it's to expose you to some of the more important aspects or one or two things about a given chapter. And so chapter 1 is a general overview of the entire textbook. So I might go in a little bit more in depth to cover all these different things, of which we will take a deeper dive into as the course unfolds. So chapter 1 covers this term called globalization. And maybe you're wondering, what is this concept of globalization all about? Well, I'm very glad you asked, because globalization has to do with how the world has shrunk essentially. And if you look at these graphics here, this is a statue of the Greek soldier who got the message in the marathon, in the Battle of Marathon, and he died after running 26.2 miles. And then we had this thing called the Pony Express, where on the western frontier we could use mail carriers and message carriers on horseback much faster, much more efficient. Then we had this telegram, but it wasn't in English, right? It was this thing, Morse code, where the sender and the receiver had to understand the dashes and the dots of Morse code. Then we got to a standard telephone, a landline. If you watch this link right here, it's not uncommon, even way back in the day, to have misdials. Little humorous video for you. Now we have this powerful device in our hand called a smartphone, whether it's an Android or an iPhone, where we can be in contact with people around the world instantly. So globalization, the world has shrunk. Well, there's different components to globalization. Before we do that, if you think about these iconic American brands, here's a Corvette. And you might think, okay, Corvette, that's an American iconic brand. Believe it or not all the components of a Corvette are from the United States. There are parts from Italy. There are parts from Austria. There are parts that, once assembled, becomes this U.S. Corvette that we associate with America, the tradition of muscle cars. But globalization, as we're going to see here, involves how countries from around the world are cooperating and working together to make products and to reach different markets. So there's two key facets of globalization. First of all, we define it by a shift toward a more integrated and interdependent world economy, which is different than an independent world economy. Kind of the opposite of globalization is isolation, where countries want to operate just exclusively within their own boundaries, right, or their own borders. But so the two key facets of globalization involve the globalization of markets and the globalization of production. Once again, when you see ideas, concepts, definitions that are highlighted in red, it's a good indication to hone your studies in there to study these things, because it's more likely to be on the exam. So the first aspect, we'll talk a little bit about globalization of markets. It's the merging of historically distinct and separate national markets into one huge global marketplace. In other words, if you travel around the world, it's very likely that you're going to see Coca-Cola, you're going to see McDonald's, you'll see IKEA. Remember now, because most of us are Americans, we're in a university in the United States, we tend to look at these things from uniquely an American perspective, but globalization involves countries from around the world. IKEA, for example, is not a US-based company, but they operate globally. And it's not just the finished products as you see here. It's also some of these, what we might call commodities, things needed to produce things that they're going to be sold in various markets. A really good example of this also is Dunkin' Donuts. So people from around the world want Dunkin' Donuts. But if you go to Dunkin's website, they have, in addition to some of the traditional donuts that you'll see in American, glazed, maple glazed, chocolate frosted, whatever, all around these different countries, Indonesia, Switzerland, UAE, Chile, UK, China, Germany, India. Dunkin' has customized certain donuts that meet the locals' taste there. So now they'll get some of the US taste, but also Dunkin' tailors some of their products to these various countries. This is the globalization of the marketplace, of markets. The globalization of production has to do with taking advantage of the factors of production, these things that we see, the labor, the energy, the land, and the capital. iPhones, for example, it's an Apple product, but it's assembled by a company called Foxconn, which operates primarily in China. Now, some of that's being shifted. We're looking at, when I say we, Apple is looking at moving it to perhaps different countries, but it's a Chinese company, Foxconn, that manufactures and assembles the iPhones. Well, there are some impediments, barriers to obstacles, if you will, to globalization. This is an unprecedented time to study international business, to study globalization. When we see the introduction of tariffs and other trade barriers, both formal and informal. Transportation costs, sometimes, especially as it relates to energy, when the cost of fuel goes up, the overall transportation costs go up. Ultimately, the consumer ends up paying the price as prices increase. And then the world is not completely stable. There's always going to be some level of economic and political risk. Imagine yourself as a company who wants to expand into new markets. What countries do you want to sell your product in or your services in? You're going to want to factor in, are there economic risks there? Is their currency unstable? There's going to be some political risks, perhaps. Is their political situation unstable? Venezuela is a country where there used to be a lot of U.S. business and businesses and business people working there. Not so much anymore, based on their political environment in Venezuela. There are global institutions out there. I'm not going to go in depth into all of them, but think about the G20, which represent the 90% of the global GDP, the group of 20, I should say, that kind of just help regulate and keep things as fair as possible so that the developed economies, the developed nations, aren't completely taking advantage of the poorer countries and the developing countries. Well, here it is. I mentioned the group of 20. They'll have like these annual meetings. It'll be big in the news, like the G20 summit is going to be in this country this year, and it rotates from location to location, hosted by one of the G20 countries. As I mentioned before, the group of 20 members represents 90% of the entire global GDP, so it's massive. What's driving globalization? One thing is this massive changes in growth and development in technology. This happens to be a snapshot of the Panama Canal, and it's so important because it reduces the length of travel. If we didn't have the Panama Canal, commerce going from the Atlantic to the Pacific would have to navigate all the way through the southern waters south of South America, which not only is it a lot further, but that is very turbulent water down there, where the vessels are more suspect to crashes in these massive storms. So technology is really driving globalization. When we look at changes in our ability to communicate, this thing called Moore's Law, which essentially states that about every 18 to 24 months, the power of microprocessors essentially doubles. It's not exact, while also costing less to produce. So over time, if we look at and apply Moore's Law, we've gone from a NASA control station, look at this room full of computers, to this person right here in a smartphone possesses more computing power than all these computers, this massive room of computers, because of Moore's Law. They get faster and more powerful, smaller, as time goes on. So that's kind of helped shrink the world. It's driving globalization. When it comes to cultural things, people now have a taste for other cultures, right? They want content from other cultures. Instagram, you can be friends with and communicate with people from all around the globe instantly. Netflix continues to turn out content from other countries around the world that is fantastic. Some of the Korean programs, some of the Indian programs. So now we have Americans who want more and more of that, as other countries want more American content or Indian content. It's shrinking the world culturally. The NFL every year plays games in different countries: England, Germany, Brazil, Mexico, and it's an ever expanding effort to get the NFL all around the world. Conversely, we have, if you're a football, not a football but a football fan, you're going to see that the major leagues over there, like the English Premier League, will have matches in the U.S. because there's an increasing appetite for international soccer in the U.S. Okay, so not everybody's on board with globalization. Some people think greater prosperity for the world. It's kind of like this: a rising tide lifts all boats. As the world becomes more prosperous, then people from even poorer countries will get more prosperous. That's one kind of angle or view of it. But others feel like, hey, you know what? No, it's the rich countries taking advantage of the cheap labor. These people who manufacture, like Nike is kind of got a bad reputation. And I'm a Nike person, has this reputation for taking advantage of low labor in some of these developing countries, not paying them very much to do very, very hard work, aka sweatshops. So not everybody is on board with globalization. Okay? Understand this. We'll define international business as any firm that is engaged in international trade or investment. It's very complex. So one of the big takeaways from this class is I want you to have a great understanding about just how complex it is to do international business. It's complex enough to do a small business in a local county here in Cobb County. If I were to run a small business, it would be immensely complex. It gets more complex if I go to across the state. More complex when I go across the U.S. because now I've got 50 different state regulations that I've got to line up with. Now we're talking about the international community. It is just enormous. So understand that, and I hope you really gain an appreciation for just how complex international business is. Okay, well that is globalization in a nutshell. If you have any questions, please reach out on my email or my phone. I'd love to hear your questions or your thoughts about globalization. That wraps up Chapter 1 Spotlight. Soon to follow will be the next Spotlight video. Have a great day. Go Nighthawks.